From LinkedIn News, I'm Leah Smart, host of Everyday Better, an award-winning podcast dedicated to personal development. Join me every week for captivating stories and research to find more fulfillment in your work and personal life. Listen to Everyday Better on the LinkedIn Podcast Network, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
From LinkedIn News, I'm Jessie Hempel, host of the Hello Monday podcast. Start your week with the Hello Monday podcast. We'll navigate career pivots. We'll learn where happiness fits in. Listen to Hello Monday with me, Jessie Hempel, on the LinkedIn Podcast Network or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our throwback episode. In our throwback episodes, we are reintroducing you to some of our most popular episodes. This is great for new listeners who want to learn more about the work we've done in the past, and it's a great refresher if you've been a listener for a long time. Enjoy. Well, let's jump into this topic. This is a topic we haven't talked about yet on the show. It's how to deal with people who are passive aggressive. And I think from one time to another, we've all had that experience. And it's one of those situations where something happens and then you say, is this really happening or am I making this up? is this an attack or not? And so it kind of drives you a little bit crazy. And so I'm really excited to jump into this topic with you. So how about we just start off with an operational definition for passive aggressiveness? What does that mean to you?
Well, to me, it means that you're keeping your needs and your wants a secret in some way, and you're holding them back. That's like on the internal. The external, you're acting in a way that makes you appear innocent or like, oh, there's nothing wrong, or even crossing over into being a bit of a martyr, like, oh, I will do this for you because I love you, kind of falling on your sword. So the passive part is like, I'm keeping whatever it is that's really important to me to myself. The aggressive part is when you're acting out in some way that is actively concealing and almost sometimes even sabotaging what it is that the other person is, whatever it is that you are wanting to subvert from another person. I can give you an example, and this is just kind of a generic one, but let's say that you're worried about your partner and you feel like your partner is drinking too much, for instance. And it's time to go to the store and they ask you, hey, would you, add beer to the list? You say, okay, sure, I can do that. And then you go to the store and like, oops, oh, I forgot. You come home and they say, well, where's the beer? Oops, I must have forgotten. I was so busy, doing these other things. That's a passive aggressive response to what the partner is requesting. So your need and want is like, I want them to not drink so much. And when they ask for what they want, I say, oh, sure, because I don't want to confront them on it. But then, oops, I forget to do what they're asking me, kind of sabotaging their interests, their wants. And I don't have to so I win in that, okay, they don't have beer, but I also haven't addressed the situation.
That's a brilliant example. Really brilliant example. So in that person's mind, what is behind that strategy? Why have they adopted this approach?
I chose kind of an emotionally charged example because think about, anytime you have to confront someone about behavior, they're telling them something that they may or may not be ready to hear, like, I think you have a problem. They're making up a lot of stories about, okay, what would it be like if I were to confront this person about what I'm perceiving as a problem? What if they don't see it as a problem? What if they get mad at me? What if they get upset? What if they leave me? I mean, you can go through a whole spectrum of responses from, oh, they'll just get a little grumpy and say, well, I'll go get it myself, to I can't live with this. I'm out of here, So as the person who is deciding to be, either intentionally or not intentionally passive aggressive, it's primarily because you want to avoid what you are assuming is going to be a huge blow up and something that will ultimately compromise the entire relationship potentially.
I love this example and the description you gave here too, because essentially that is exactly what they're doing. They're avoiding the difficult conversation. Mm-hmm. And what this show and your show is all about is how to actually engage in these difficult conversations. What I found is that a lot of times people have a conflict management strategy or negotiation strategy that is based 100% on hope. Like, well,
yes.
I hope this just changes.
Right. Like if I keep forgetting, he'll forget or she'll forget that they asked for it. Eventually it'll just go away. Kind of the animal that will stick its head under the couch and think, if I can't see you, you can't see me. And
Hmm.
it's kind of the equivalent of that, like just sort of sticking your head under the covers and thinking, okay, if I just stay underground a while, it'll go away. And
Right.
it never does.
And what we're seeing here is that it's an evolutionary fear response. We have the fight, flight, and freeze. So
Right.
fight is engaging in a kind of inappropriate, aggressive manner. This is closer to the freeze or flee. You're running away from the
Right.
conflict or just freezing in the face of it, but with a little bit of fight underneath
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But you're doing it in a way where you could create a little bit of plausible deniability, so you could avoid the conflict if it really does come, if they call you on it.
Yeah, thank you for that phrase, plausible deniability. And probably someone who is acting in a passive aggressive way is a master at that.
Exactly. I think for the listeners who might be tempted to engage in this type of behavior, we've probably done a decent job of dissuading you from doing that.
I
I
hope
hope
so.
so. So I want to focus the majority of our attention for the rest of the conversation on how we can deal with somebody who is being passive aggressive. What do you think we can do to address those issues?
I think first is, well, one thing that I appreciate, thank you again for mentioning How Can I Say This, the podcast. One of the guests that I interviewed early on is named Cindy Noble, and she is a conflict coach. And one of the listener questions that came up was around passive aggressiveness. And her first piece of advice was to drop the label of passive aggressive. She said, as soon as we put a label on something, then we kind of put it in a box. We make up stories about it. We're assuming things about the other person. That doesn't necessarily move us forward. Sometimes labeling something can help us deal with it and unpack it, but at the same time, it can limit the curiosity that we have because we're coming into it with certain assumptions. So I really appreciated that invitation to question even the assumption that somebody is acting passive aggressively. And once you start noticing passive aggressive behavior as it is, defined, you start noticing it everywhere. And I think, like, say you're the partner who is, to go back to our beer example, say you're the partner that's being denied the beverage and you suspect that the person you've asked to buy it for you is being passive aggressive. And what you're asking me, Kwame, is like, how would that person then perhaps engage that other person in conversation? Am I following you right? Okay. First, is to maybe recognize their motivation. And we talked a little bit about some of those motivations being on the spectrum of just, I hope it goes away, to I'm afraid you're going to leave me. And most of the time, it might not always be true, but I would guess that for most people, if you're in a relatively healthy relationship, the motivation is to keep the other person safe. So think about the partner that doesn't want to buy the beer. They're just like, I want to protect you. I don't want you to be an alcoholic. I don't want you to die early. I don't want you to have liver problems. So the motivation of the person that is passive aggressive is actually, in their mind, perhaps coming from a place of love. Whereas the other person who's sort of the victim of the passive aggressive behavior is thinking, you're just trying to sabotage me. You're trying to make me unhappy. So for that person who is seeing themselves as the victim of the passive aggressive, to maybe step back and say, okay, why might this other person be not fulfilling my wishes? What is it that they might be hoping for? What are they afraid of? Because that's really what's underneath the passive aggressive behavior, is some level of fear. So to think about that and reflect on that, and then be able just to ask an open question and say, I find it interesting that the last, couple of times that I've asked you to get this for me, you've forgotten, or they're out of stock, or, something, is there something else going on? Or, what do you think is happening here? What I'm suggesting here requires, I will admit, quite a bit of self-awareness and patience and ability to kind of reflect on the conversation and remove some of the emotion from it. But I would hope, again, that as, anyone who's listening to this and thinking about it, they have that, it's like we can develop that capacity to be able to step back and reflect instead of having a knee-jerk response and saying, well, you idiot, why do you keep forgetting? you know, so to be able to kind of step back and say, what is the motivation? And often the motivation, even if we don't agree with the motivation or we think that the motivation is flawed in some way, it's what's true for that other person. And so to be able to acknowledge that and say, because it might be that that person's fears are unfounded. I know you might be worried that I'm drinking too much, but I can assure you that I'm really conscious of what I'm doing. It's under control. I do it for the taste, not because I want to get buzzed. I mean, it could be all sorts of things. Of course, it could turn out that this person is a budding alcoholic, but let's kind of dial it back a bit, because as soon as you assume that person's a budding alcoholic, then the conversation is probably going to get very charged and emotional and difficult to sort through.
I love this. This is great. And I think one of the things that really makes it difficult for us to engage with somebody who's being passive aggressive in a meaningful, tempered type of way is the fact that as humans, most of my listeners are humans, we enjoy having control.
Brace the rudders! Raise the sails! Raise the sails!
Captain, an unidentified ship is approaching. Over.
Roger. Wait, is that an enterprise sales solution?
Reach sales professionals, not professional sailors. With LinkedIn ads, you can target the right people by industry, job title, and more. We'll even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign. Get started today at linkedin.com/marketer. Terms and conditions apply.
We feel safe when we're in control. And even when our control is to our detriment, we feel safer having control. That's why you feel safer driving a car, even though it is significantly, statistically more likely for you to die in a car accident than in the air. In the air, you're safer than anywhere else, really.
Yes.
But you have zero control, and that makes us feel afraid and uncomfortable.
Yes.
And so
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was almost going to say, I thought when you were talking about driving a car, I thought you feel more control when you're in the driver's seat than in the passenger seat.
Exactly.
And the passenger is probably, it's like, what is it called? Backseat driving. Where do you think that comes from? It's because it's like we feel like a loss of control and we're trying to get it back in some way.
And that's what we're seeing with this passive aggressive behavior. We see somebody is trying to control us in some way. They're doing it, but they're doing it in a way where, again, there's plausible deniability, but we see that they're trying to have an impact on us, but prevent us from recognizing that impact. And that's what really bothers us. So we respond aggressively. And to the point that you mentioned about assumptions, that's critical, because really what an assumption is the process of filling in the gaps in our information. And the problem with that, like you said, is that it stifles curiosity. Above all else, conflict is an opportunity to learn. It reveals the truth. And if you fill that gap with assumptions, then you are impeding your ability to learn. And I think if we were to approach these conversations in a way where we're not saying, I'm going to confront this person or I'm trying to convince this person, but we say, this is an opportunity for me to learn more about this behavior, it'll make it less threatening for you and less threatening for the person on the other side.
I'm guessing you can back me up on this, but even as people who are aware and have these kinds of conversations for a living, we can still get stumped. And I'm thinking of a time recently I was part of a mediation, and there was a lawyer that I, in the negotiation itself and the mediation, was labeling as being passive aggressive. He was fidgety. He was clicking his pen. He was shuffling through papers, all while other people were talking. He was sometimes leaning over and whispering to his client. And my mind was going like, okay, what is this guy doing? He's being he was late for the for the mediation. He was the only person. We had to wait for him. And so I'm thinking he's just posturing, he's trying to be distracting. He's kind of sucking the energy out of the room. He's doing this because, he wants to just kind of puff himself up in some way. I was making up all sorts of stories, right? And I recognized it in the moment, and I wasn't quite sure how to respond to it. I kept hoping my fellow mediator who was co-mediating with me would address it so I wouldn't have to. And that might be another form of passive aggressive, like sort of like keeping quiet so that you hope someone else will deal with the sticky situation. We didn't say anything, and he eventually sort of settled down. And I think what it ultimately was that he really wanted to speak. Like, he wasn't called on first, and he really had something to say. And so by labeling that passive aggressive, it kind of made me sort of freeze up. Like, I don't know how to deal with this. Where instead, like you were saying, if I had turned to curiosity, let go of the story, and just been able to say, perhaps like, you seem unsettled. Is there something that you need? Or, can we do something? Or do you have something you want to say sooner rather than later? Something that perhaps maybe gave him a little bit of space and just gently shined the light on the behavior without making up a story about it or trying to call him out on it.
And you know what's interesting? Sometimes we make a mountain out of a molehill.
Right.
And the person's like, oh, I'm doing that? I didn't.
Exactly.
I had no idea. No idea. I was working with somebody recently. He was one of the like a lead attorney for a pro sports team, and so he was saying that with his body language, a lot of times he's criticized for seeming closed off and cold. But what's interesting is that with the way he was raised, with his religious upbringing, crossing your arms, folding your arms was a sign of reverence.
Oh.
And so from a young age, he always did that. And so now as an adult in professional settings, people think that he's closed off or judging what they're saying because his arms are always folded. He's like, I don't know that I'm doing this. This is just what my arms do. Yeah. But by actually saying, hey, Joe, is everything okay? Yeah, everything's fine. Why? Well, your arms are crossed and your eyebrows are down. It's like, I had no idea. That's how I think.
Exactly. And so to release the assumptions that looking at him saying, oh, he's closed off and he's being cold and unengaged, to check it out. Notice the assumption that you're making up in your head, notice the story, and then find the words to just check it out with a simple open-ended question that will hopefully start with an open-ended question that will hopefully start the conversation.
One thing, I was talking to a friend earlier today, actually, and I was saying with my relationships with my friends and family, I am constantly in a state of conflict, but not in a bad way, because whenever I recognize some kind of discrepancy or some issue, I treat it as a signal for investigation. And when I approach it in a way that's compassionate with curiosity, it's funny, I'm blending my term. I should just say compassionate curiosity. I made that up. Just use it.
Yep. Yes, just use it.
Yeah. So with compassionate curiosity, they are really receptive. And not only are they receptive, but they're appreciative because they recognize that I'm doing it because I do care. And that's how it is in a social type of setting, but also in a business setting. If you're willing to point out to somebody, hey, I'm noticing some behavior here. I'm noticing X, Y, Z. What's going on? Is everything okay? Something like that. You never know what the problem is. Maybe they need help. And it's a way that you can be creative in the negotiation and exchange value in a new way. And you can use that information kind of like as a bargaining chip. That's good.
Yeah.
But at the root of all of this, whether it's social, familial, or business, we're all trying to manage these relationships and recognizing and investigating what we initially label as passive aggressive behavior is going to do wonders when it comes to strengthening these relationships.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if we're honest with ourselves, we've all acted in a passive aggressive manner at some point in our lives, if not on a daily basis, then on, a semi-regular basis. And sometimes we do it because we are trying to protect someone and it is harmless. But most of the time, it's simply kind of a front, a response to avoiding a difficult situation. And in that case, it helps to think also, like, if I were the one on the receiving end of the feedback about whatever it is that somebody doesn't want to tell me, how would I want to hear it? What would I want them to say? How would I want them to approach it? And think about that for yourself. I mean, it kind of goes back to the golden rule of treating others how you want to be treated and tapping into any empathy that you might have for their, allowing that to bring forth some empathy as you talk with them.
And I think back to those times when I was passive aggressive, and I'll own it. I've done it before. It never works.
No,
it just never works. It's like all I do is put an inconvenient little speed bump, and now they end up still doing what they want to do, but just a little bit more annoyed.
Yeah. It's like you're kind of turning. Just as you were saying that, I had this image of somebody sort of turning a screw. It's like it can, in some ways, if you realize you're being passive aggressive, it can feel good in the moment. Like, that, little tiny things I think of, Like, say you work in an office setting and you know that the receptionist, it drives her crazy when you leave your documents on the copier when you're done or something. And you know this, or you don't wash your mug when you're finished with it and you just leave it in the sink. You know that that bugs her, but yet you do it anyway. And you sort of take this little silent pleasure that she's going to come to the sink and be like, oh, here we go again. Can't they learn? Of really like annoying somebody. That's sort of another level of passive aggressiveness that is not necessarily about, protecting someone. It's about control. And it's about like, I think your rules are silly, but I'm not going to tell you. I'm just going to defy them. And that doesn't work either. I mean, just as I'm describing it, we're thinking, what is this, kindergarten? But yet adults act like that all the time.
It's true. It's true. And what's funny is that it's psychologically, the harder you have to work for something, the more you appreciate it and enjoy it. And so what it is that in your mind, you have to justify the effort. Well, I worked really hard for this. I must really like it. And so when we put these little impediments in front of people, you're making them work harder for what it is that they want. And then they get it anyway because it's ineffective. And then they like it more and they're just more entrenched in their position. So not only is it ineffective in that it doesn't lead to the outcome that we want, but also it might take us further away from where we want to go if we engage in passive aggressive behavior.
Yeah. I mean, basically passive aggressive behavior is a wedge in healthy relationship. And it can only serve to drive you further apart. And that has a ripple effect. You might think it's just between you and one other person, but it really does affect other people as well. And it affects you, even if you feel like this moment of guilty pleasure because you've, stuck it to the man or whatever, that comes back to you and it becomes part of who you are. And I'm sort of speaking in a slightly woo-woo energetic way, but I make no apologies for that. It's like how we choose to treat other people. It becomes part of our DNA. And ultimately, we will start to think that that behavior is okay with other relationships. And then we'll stop even noticing it and we won't have the ability to check out our assumptions, to be curious and to engage the other person.
And, it's like you said, you'll start to do it. Essentially, you'll start to do it more. You're creating a bad habit. And if there's one thing I want people to get from this podcast is that I want you to develop the habit of engagement, because we might tell ourselves, well, I'm not sure, I don't know how to do it effectively. Well, practicing is the best way to do it. And as we get older, the relationships we have will be higher stakes. We'll have more responsibilities in our social and family lives. And then we'll also have more responsibilities in our professional lives. So every time we have the opportunity to engage in conflict, it's practicing for the next one, which will be higher stakes.
As we were talking about before, at the root of some of this is about control, which means that in order to engage the other thing, the one thing I would ask you to stop and do is just check your ego. Notice where your ego is getting in the way of engaging with this other person. Because I believe that having a healthy conversation requires a good dose of humility. There's a possibility that your story, your assumption is wrong. It's possible that even your position is wrong compared to the other person. And so being able to have some level of humility and checking your ego at the door is going to go a long way to being able to have that engagement that we're talking about.
Congratulations! You've just joined an elite club. By listening to a full episode, you're now officially on the Negotiate Anything team. So welcome aboard. What most team members do is they subscribe to the podcast because that allows them to automatically get the latest episodes of the show. The best things in life lie on the other side of difficult conversations. Keep learning, keep practicing, and keep getting better. Your relationships will improve, your career will soar, and you'll have the confidence you need to get the most out of these crucial conversations. Again, thank you for joining the team. We're excited to have you, and I will see you in the next episode. I'll catch you later.